In the late 1970s, a quiet revolution in American law enforcement was taking place in the most unlikely of arenas. Smoke-filled social clubs, dingy bars, and cramped back rooms along the eastern seaboard. Inside those rooms, organized crime families that had grown powerful in the shadows of the Great Depression and Prohibition were making decisions that affected construction sites, shipping docks, unions, and neighborhoods from New York to Florida. Their reach was enormous, their code of silence nearly unbreakable, and their confidence in their secrecy almost complete. What they did not know was that one of the men sitting across the tables from them, listening carefully, laughing at their jokes, and handling their errands, was not a loyal associate at all, but an undercover agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Under the false identity of a low-level jewel thief named Donnie Brasco, Joseph Dominic Pistone spent years living a double life, embedded inside the Bonanno crime family, and in contact with members of other families that formed the backbone of the American mafia. He carried no gun, because discovery of a government-issued weapon would have exposed him instantly. He operated with minimal backup, frequently out of contact with his handlers for days at a time, and every decision he made, what to say, what not to say, how to react to a provocation, could mean the difference between continuing the operation or being quietly taken for a ride from which there would be no return. By the time the Bureau finally pulled him out of the field in 1981, his work had contributed to more than 100 federal convictions, reshaped FBI strategy against organized crime, and prompted mafia leaders to place a substantial contract on his life. To understand how a man ends up at the center of that kind of pressure, trusted by mobsters who believed he was one of them, yet loyal to an agency that had historically struggled to penetrate their world, you have to start far from New York. Social clubs and FBI command posts. You have to go back to a small industrial city on Lake Erie in the last months before the Second World War, and to a family of Italian Americans whose values and circumstances prepared their son, in ways they could not have predicted, for one of the most audacious undercover assignments in the history of American law enforcement. Joseph Dominic Pistone was born on the 17th of September, 1939, in Erie, Pennsylvania, a city whose steel mills, foundries, and factories were part of the backbone of American industry. His parents, Anthony and Grace, were of Sicilian heritage, part of the vast wave of Italian immigrants and first-generation families who had carved out communities across the Northeast. They were not wealthy, not connected to any criminal network, and not interested in shortcuts. Anthony worked as a truck driver and later as a maintenance worker and plumber. Grace was a homemaker who kept a tight household. The world into which their son arrived was one still scarred by the Great Depression and about to be transformed by the war effort. And in such a world, steady work and a spotless reputation were essential. When Joe was still a boy, the family left Erie and moved east to Paterson, New Jersey. The post-war years had turned Paterson, known as the Silk City, for its once bustling textile mills, into a crowded industrial town marked by ethnic neighborhoods, factory jobs, and tough streets where kids learned early how to judge character and navigate unwritten codes. For Italian-American families, there was a strong sense of community and identity, reinforced by language, food, and faith. There was also, just beneath the surface, the knowledge that some men in the neighborhood held a different kind of power. The American Mafia, or La Cosa Nostra as it was often called internally, had by then established a deep presence in New Jersey and New York. By the time Pistone was growing up, the Commission, the informal governing body of the major mafia families, had been in place for years. In Paterson and neighboring cities, organized crime figures were involved in gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and various forms of theft and fraud. Children did not necessarily know the details, but they knew which bars or social clubs were for certain guys, and which men in the neighborhood inspired a particular kind of deference. Suits that were too sharp for a factory paycheck, cars that were too new for a modest row house, and a certain confident manner of moving through the streets, all marked out who was connected. In this environment, young Joe grew up, observing carefully. Later in life, he would emphasize how important that early training of the eye and ear became. Knowing when to talk and when to listen, how to read a room, and how to distinguish between petty braggarts and truly dangerous men. His own family kept clear boundaries. His parents believed strongly in honest work, in doing your job without complaints, and in avoiding entanglements that could bring trouble to the door. They did not romanticize the local toughs. They saw them as potential sources of risk. That perspective quietly shaped their son's outlook. He absorbed the culture of the neighborhood, its language, its customs, its humor, but he also absorbed the house rule that you stayed on the right side of the line. Paterson in the 1940s and 1950s was a place where opportunity and danger coexisted. Many boys Joe's age grew up quickly, working part-time jobs to help their families, running errands through busy streets, or hanging out on corners where minor mischief could, in some cases, give way to more serious crimes. Joe earned money through legitimate work. The experiences taught him the rhythms of blue-collar life, the early mornings, the factory whistles, the sense of pride that came from a paycheck earned through sweat rather than schemes. At the same time, exposure to the city's rough edges gave him a practical education in how people behaved when they were angry, scared, or trying to impress others. Those observations, stored away without fanfare, would later become part of the mental toolkit he used to survive long stretches among volatile criminals. Religion and family life also played a significant role in his upbringing. Like many Italian-American families of the era, the Pistones maintained close ties to their local Catholic parish. This translated into more than just Sunday services. It meant participation in community events, adherence to moral teachings about right and wrong, and a respect for authority, whether that authority came from parents, priests, or teachers. The idea that there was a clear line between lawful and unlawful behavior, and that crossing it carried not just practical consequences but moral ones, was repeatedly reinforced. It is one of the ironies of his life that Pistone would later adopt the external mannerisms and habits of the very men his family distrusted, while internally holding fast to the ethical framework they had given him. As he moved into adolescence in the 1950s, the United States was undergoing a complex transformation. The war was over, the economy was booming, and a new consumer culture was taking shape. Yet for many working-class families in places like Paterson, life remained grounded in modest expectations. The ideal was not sudden wealth but stability. A job, a house, marriage, children, and the hope that each generation would do slightly better than the one before. Crime stories occasionally made headlines, the violent struggles between rival gangs, the sensational accounts of high-profile mob trials, but they did not fundamentally alter the daily routines of most residents. For teenage boys, the choice between the straight path and the crooked one was often less a single dramatic decision than a series of small choices about who to spend time with and what kind of respect they wanted to earn. By all available accounts, Pistone stayed away from serious trouble. He was not a saint, but he was not drawn into the orbit of local racketeers. He attended public schools in Paterson, played sports, and watched the adults around him navigate life's pressures. Academically, he was capable enough to continue his education beyond high school, which already set him apart from many of his peers. He enrolled at what was then Paterson State College, later William Paterson University, where he pursued studies that would qualify him to teach. Teaching was a respectable, stable profession, and it fit with the blue-collar aspiration of upward mobility without pretension. College also broadened his horizons. He encountered classmates from other backgrounds, absorbed broader conversations about politics and society, and experienced a more structured intellectual environment than the one available on Paterson's streets. Yet even there, he did not lose touch with his roots. He still spent time in the neighborhoods and social settings he had grown up in, still heard the same accents and expressions, still understood intuitively the unwritten rules of respect and insult that governed interactions in Italian-American communities. The ability to move between these worlds, academic and streetwise, formal and informal, was becoming one of his defining traits. The late 1950s brought another formative experience: military service. Like many young men of his generation, Pistone entered the U.S. Navy. Military life imposed a new discipline: the chain of command, the strict schedules, the necessity of relying on others and being reliable in return. All of this reinforced the lessons of responsibility and self-control that his parents had tried to teach at home. The Navy also exposed him to the national and international scene. He met people from many regions of the United States, worked alongside individuals whose life stories were very different from those of Patterson's Italian-American enclaves, and gained a better sense of the country's scale and diversity. During his time in the Navy, he became connected with naval intelligence work, engaging in tasks that required discretion, attention to detail, and the ability to process information without broadcasting his intentions. Even though these assignments were a world away from the later intricacies of mafia infiltration, they introduced him to the broader field of investigative and intelligence work. He discovered that he had a talent for careful observation and a patience for long-term, methodical effort traits that would later make him an ideal candidate for undercover operations. Upon completion of his service, Pistone returned to civilian life with a clearer sense of direction. He had a college education, military experience, and a background that allowed him to move comfortably in working-class environments. He married and began a family life that, from the outside, looked conventional. He and his wife would eventually have 3 daughters, and his role as husband and father added another layer of responsibility. Whatever professional path he chose would now have direct implications for the safety and stability of people who depended on him. In the early 1960s, he briefly worked as a school teacher, putting his college training to use. Standing in front of a classroom, managing the behavior of children and teenagers, and adapting explanations to different personalities provided another kind of preparation for the undercover work to come. Teaching demanded quick judgments, improvisation, and the ability to read subtle shifts in mood skills that translate surprisingly well to high-stakes interactions in more dangerous settings. But as much as he respected the profession, he felt drawn toward investigative work and the sense of mission that came with protecting the public from serious crime. That pull led him to accept positions in federal investigative services. After his time with naval intelligence, he joined the United States Customs Service as a special agent. In customs, he investigated smuggling, cargo theft, and other offenses that required him to probe beneath the surface of seemingly routine commercial activities. He became familiar with informants, surveillance, paper trails, and the challenge of tracing illicit activity that was designed to blend in with legitimate business. These cases sometimes brought him into contact with individuals connected, directly or indirectly, to organized crime groups that sought to exploit ports and transportation networks. His work in customs solidified 2 things. First, that he had a genuine aptitude for investigative work. Second, that he was increasingly interested in the complex, interconnected world of organized crime. He understood that this world did not consist only of men in flashy suits making threats in back rooms. It extended into docks and warehouses, trucking companies and storefronts, and into the pockets of officials who could be bribed or intimidated. It was a hidden structure built inside legitimate society, and dismantling it required a patient, layered approach, rather than simple arrests of visible figures. By the late 1960s, the federal government was rethinking its approach to such problems. The FBI, which had long emphasized bank robbers, kidnappers, and, under J. Edgar Hoover, domestic political targets, was beginning to devote more sustained attention to organized crime. Congressional hearings, public scandals, and the testimony of insiders, such as mob turncoat Joseph Valakai, had exposed to the broader public what law enforcement had known for years. La Cosa Nostra was not a loose collection of neighborhood gangs, but an entrenched national network with its own rules, hierarchies, and substantial economic power. In this changing climate, the FBI was looking for agents who could operate effectively in long-term investigations that might involve undercover assignments, cultivation of informants, and complex prosecutions under new legal tools like the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, which would come into force in 1970. Pistone, with his background in a tough urban environment, his Italian-American heritage, his experience in customs and naval intelligence, and his demonstrated patience and adaptability, was an appealing candidate. He applied to the FBI and was accepted, entering the bureau at a time when it was still dominated by Hoover-era culture, but slowly evolving. At the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, he underwent the standard rigorous training: firearms, defensive tactics, legal instruction, and the Bureau's particular approach to investigative procedure. There, he joined a cohort of agents who came from a variety of professional backgrounds: former police officers, lawyers, accountants, military veterans, each bringing different strengths to the institution. He was not yet marked out as an undercover specialist. At this stage, he was one more new agent, learning the rules of a powerful and tradition-bound organization. When he left Quantico and reported to his first field assignments, he began to see the distance between the Bureau's formal culture and the street realities he knew so well. The FBI emphasized suits, ties, and carefully prepared reports. But the targets he would eventually need to approach the burglars, hijackers, smugglers, and mob associates lived by a different code. He was uniquely positioned to bridge that gap. He could sit in an office and prepare a case file, but he could also walk into a bar in a working-class neighborhood and blend in without drawing suspicion. That dual identity, born of his upbringing and early career, would soon become the cornerstone of his contribution to the Bureau's most ambitious effort to infiltrate the American mafia from the inside. When Pistone emerged from the FBI Academy and stepped into his first assignments, the Bureau itself was in a period of transition. J. Edgar Hoover had died in 1972, and in the years around that moment, the FBI was being pushed from Congress, the courts, and the press to adapt to a changing landscape of crime. Bank robberies and kidnappings still mattered, but so did elaborate fraud schemes, corruption, and the entrenched power of organized crime. In that environment, the skills of a man who could move comfortably in working-class neighborhoods, keep his own counsel, and build rapport without broadcasting his intentions became increasingly valuable. His early postings were not glamorous. Like many new agents, he cut his teeth on a mix of fugitive cases, property crimes, and investigative support. The work required diligence and respect for procedure, tracking leads, interviewing witnesses, writing reports that could stand up in court. This routine, though far removed from the high-risk undercover operation that would later define his public identity, taught him how to build a case, step by step. It also confirmed to his superiors that he was reliable under pressure, attentive to detail, and comfortable working in the field instead of staying behind a desk. Before long, he was transferred to the New York field office, the largest and among the most challenging postings in the Bureau. New York, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was a city under strain. Crime rates were rising, the economy was shifting, and the influence of organized crime could be felt from the docks of Brooklyn to the garment district of Manhattan, from construction sites in Queens to restaurants in Little Italy. For the FBI, New York was not just another city. It was a central battleground against La Cosa Nostra, whose major families, the Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese organizations, had their headquarters or major crews there. Pistone was assigned to squads working on truck hijackings and related thefts, a crucial area where ordinary crime and organized crime overlapped. Hijacked trucks meant stolen cargo, electronics, clothing, liquor, cigarettes, and, importantly, jewelry. These crimes hurt businesses and consumers, but they also provided a steady income stream for criminal groups that could organize the thefts and then move the goods through a network of fences and brokers. While some hijackings were the work of small-time operators, the more organized and profitable operations usually required protection or direct involvement from mafia figures who controlled access to certain docks, warehouses, and trucking companies. Investigating hijackings meant more than showing up at crime scenes. By the time agents arrived, the stolen goods were often already being moved, dispersed, or hidden. Witnesses were reluctant to talk. Drivers might fear retaliation if they named names. Company officials might prefer to write off losses rather than risk being seen as informants. The Bureau could not simply wait for leads to walk through the door. It had to send people into the world where deals were made and stolen goods changed hands. This is where Pistone's particular background and temperament began to stand out. Supervisors recognized that he had the appearance, accent, and mannerisms to blend into the bars, cafes, and social clubs where hijackers and fences spent their time. He knew how to talk to people who earned their living in the gray areas between legality and crime, how to project just enough toughness to be respected without overplaying his hand. He also had the discipline to maintain a cover story consistently, a necessity for any undercover work more ambitious than a single controlled buy. The FBI's traditional culture had not always embraced deep cover operations. Under Hoover, the Bureau had favored informants, surveillance, and courtroom testimony from cooperating witnesses. However, as organized crime groups adapted and strengthened their code of silence, the value of placing an agent directly inside a criminal network became harder to ignore. By the early 1970s, some agents were being encouraged to develop longer-term undercover identities that could be used across multiple investigations. Pistone fit that mold. In New York, he began to work small undercover assignments, testing his ability to pose as a criminal without arousing suspicion. These early cases often revolved around stolen property cars, electronics, and, increasingly, jewelry. The jewelry trade was attractive to thieves and fences because it was compact, valuable, and relatively easy to move. A small bag could contain thousands of dollars worth of items. It was also an area where ethnic familiarity and personal trust mattered. Deals were often made face-to-face in back rooms, not through formal channels. As these assignments accumulated, a more fully formed undercover identity took shape. He needed a persona that could move in circles where hijackers, fences, and low-level organized crime associates operated, but that did not immediately attract the attention of the most powerful mafia figures. The identity had to be plausible, flexible, and sustainable over time. It had to withstand casual questioning and more pointed scrutiny from people who were constantly on guard against law enforcement infiltration. Out of this practical need emerged Donnie Brasco, a name and persona that would eventually become famous. Donnie was a small-time jewel thief and burglar, an Italian-American from the East Coast who knew the streets, understood the rules of the underworld, and had enough nerve to handle risky transactions. He was not portrayed as a hardened killer or a major boss that would have been implausible and dangerous. Instead, he was someone looking to earn, to move merchandise, and to build connections. His criminal history, as described in conversations, was carefully crafted but limited enough that it could not easily be checked against real arrest records. The creation of Donnie Brasco was not done in a single moment. It evolved as Pistone moved through different operations. At first, the identity was used primarily to infiltrate groups involved in truck hijackings and fencing operations. He would walk into bars and social clubs known to host hijackers, introduce himself, and slowly develop relationships, offering to buy or sell stolen goods. He had to know the going prices, the slang terms, and the practical details of how such deals usually worked. A man claiming to be a jewel thief who could not recognize basic stones or settings would be exposed quickly. To prepare, he studied the jewelry business in depth. He learned how items were graded, how they were appraised, and how they were commonly altered or broken down to make them harder to trace. He immersed himself in the language of the trade, both legitimate and illicit. This study was not theoretical. It was a matter of safety. The more convincingly he could answer questions about weight, cut, and value, the less likely it was that anyone would suspect he was something other than what he claimed. FBI procedures evolved in tandem with his developing undercover role. He had handlers, supervisors, and case agents who monitored his work, debriefed him, and helped shape the strategic goals of the operations he was part of. These handlers provided logistical support, safe meeting locations, emergency contact protocols, and, when necessary, technical surveillance. But much of the time, he was on his own, navigating unpredictable human environments where decisions had to be made in seconds. His family life ran in parallel to this emerging undercover career. At home, he was a husband and father of young children, living what outwardly seemed like the life of any mid-level federal employee in the New York area. He could not, of course, share the full details of his work with his wife, though she knew he was involved in dangerous assignments. The stress of balancing these roles was considerable. He might spend days or weeks cultivating relationships with criminals, speaking their language and absorbing their attitudes, and then have to switch abruptly back into the role of suburban family man. That constant shifting of identity required a high degree of mental control and emotional compartmentalization. The early 1970s saw him undertake an undercover operation aimed squarely at a group of professional burglars and fences connected to hijacked goods. Working as Donnie Brasco, He gained the trust of criminals who specialized in obtaining and moving stolen merchandise. These individuals might not have been formally inducted members of any mafia family, but many operated under the protection or influence of such organizations. Through them, he began to glimpse more closely how lines of authority and profit-sharing connected street-level thieves to higher-level figures. This preliminary phase of operating as Donnie was successful. The investigation produced arrests and convictions, disrupting particular theft and fencing networks. From a standard law enforcement perspective, that could have been the end of it. Close down the case, document the results, and move on. But as the operation wound down, Pistone and some of his colleagues realized that something more had been achieved. The Donnie Brasco persona and the relationships it had created were not limited to a single group of hijackers. The identity was becoming known in certain circles as that of a reliable, crime-inclined associate. Importantly, some of the people he had met in this capacity had connections to larger, more structured criminal organizations, including the New York Mafia families. They were friends of friends, acquaintances, or low-level associates who moved between the world of independent thieves and the more disciplined environment of La Cosa Nostra crews. For the FBI agents thinking strategically about how to penetrate the higher levels of organized crime, this presented an opportunity. Instead of retiring the Donnie Brasco identity after one investigation, they could consider extending it, using the trust already built as a bridge into more significant targets. Using the same undercover identity across multiple investigations was not without risk. The longer an alias existed in the criminal world, the more chances there were for inconsistencies to emerge, or for someone to question a past event. It also demanded a greater commitment from the agent living that identity, who would have to spend more time away from conventional assignments and from family. Nevertheless, the potential investigative payoff was considerable. An agent already accepted as a crook by some criminals might, with patience, be introduced deeper into the network. Within the Bureau, discussions began about whether Pistone should be tasked with a long-term, undercover operation aimed explicitly at infiltrating a mafia family. It was not a decision taken lightly. No agent had ever attempted to live for years inside such an organization, under deep cover. Informants with mafia backgrounds had provided critical information in the past, but they were insiders, turned government witnesses, not government agents pretending to be insiders. An operation that depended on an agent convincingly passing as a criminal associate, day in and day out, with minimal contact with normal bureau life, carried unprecedented risks. Those risks had to be weighed against the potential advantages. Traditional investigative tools had repeatedly run up against the mafia's culture of secrecy. Wiretaps and bugs, though sometimes successful, were difficult to place and often limited to specific locations. Informants could be unreliable, motivated by self-interest, or compromised. A deeply embedded agent, by contrast, could observe meetings, business arrangements, and internal disputes directly. He could provide context that a recorded snippet of conversation might not reveal. Pistone's name rose to the top of the list of candidates for such an assignment for several reasons. His unassuming demeanor made him less likely to attract unwanted attention from law enforcement or criminals suspicious of flashy newcomers. His Italian-American heritage allowed him to fit naturally into the ethnic and cultural environment of the New York Mafia. His proven success in earlier undercover roles showed that he possessed the necessary patience and self-control. Perhaps most importantly, he had demonstrated an ability to manage the psychological strain of living under an assumed identity without losing sight of his real allegiances. When his superiors approached him with the idea of a long-term infiltration of a mafia family, he understood that this would not be a routine assignment. It would mean years of living undercover, with limited support, constantly surrounded by individuals who would respond harshly if they ever suspected betrayal. It would also mean exposing his family to indirect risk. If his cover were blown, those who felt deceived might seek to retaliate. Nonetheless, he agreed. For him, as he later described, the chance to deliver a decisive blow against entrenched organized crime and to test the limits of what undercover work could accomplish outweighed the dangers. The planning phase that followed was careful and deliberate. The Bureau had to determine which mafia family would be the primary target, how the Donnie Brasco identity would be reintroduced and developed, and what safeguards could be put in place to protect both the agent and the integrity of potential prosecutions. Supervisors coordinated with prosecutors who would eventually bring cases based on the evidence gathered. They set broad objectives to identify key players, document criminal activities, and, if possible, collect evidence that could support RICO charges aimed not just at individuals, but at the organizational structure itself. Meanwhile, Pistone concentrated on refining his undercover persona. Every detail mattered: where Donnie was said to be from, what kinds of crimes he had supposedly committed in the past, which people he claimed to know, and how he explained his current presence in New York. He worked on his speech patterns, his clothing, where Donnie was said to be from, what kinds of crimes he had supposedly committed in the past, which people he claimed to know, and how he explained his current presence in New York. He worked on his speech patterns, his clothing, his habits in bars and restaurants. The goal was not to imitate the most stereotypical image of a mobster, which could seem forced, but to inhabit the role of a plausible small-time operator whose background and ambitions made sense in the context of the existing criminal ecosystem. He also had to accept certain constraints that came with the role. As a federal agent, he could not instigate or participate in serious acts of violence or other irreparable harm. Yet he had to appear willing to operate in a world where such acts were a constant risk. This created a delicate balancing act. He would have to maneuver conversations and situations in ways that kept him close to the action, in a position to observe and report, but not directly responsible for the worst offenses. That required tactical thinking, quick responses, and, at times, the ability to divert or delay decisions without arousing suspicion. By the mid-1970s, the stage was set. The Donnie Brasco identity existed in the criminal world as that of a cautious but capable jewel thief and fence. Organized crime families in New York were facing pressure from law enforcement, but remained powerful and confident in their code of silence. The FBI, armed with new legal tools and a more aggressive strategy against organized crime, was prepared to attempt something unprecedented, sending one of its own into the heart of a mafia family, not for weeks or months, but for years. Joseph Dominic Pistone, shaped by his upbringing in Paterson, his service in the Navy, his experience in customs, and his early undercover work for the Bureau, was about to step into that role more completely than any agent had before. The decision to turn months of planning into an active operation became reality in the mid-1970s, when Joseph Pistone, under the name of Donnie Brasco, began to spend more time on the streets of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn than in any FBI office. The goal was straightforward in theory, yet extraordinarily difficult in practice. Use the persona of a jewel thief to penetrate the loose networks of thieves and fences that orbited around the New York Mafia, and from there move gradually toward the inner circles of a crime family. There would be no dramatic entrances, no sudden declarations of allegiance. Instead, the entire operation was built on the slow accumulation of presence, trust, and reputation. He started by haunting the places where he knew stolen goods were traded: bars, cafes, and social clubs along the waterfronts, and in neighborhoods like Little Italy and parts of Brooklyn. The FBI had intelligence about which locations were frequented by hijackers and fences, but intelligence on paper was very different from a living, breathing introduction. Pistone would walk into a bar, order a drink, and say little. He listened to who talked about what, who paid for whose tab, and who seemed to command respect. In this early phase, his main tool was patience. He later noted that the trick to getting accepted was not to push. Men who were already involved in crime were naturally suspicious of anyone too eager to make connections. If Donnie simply became part of the furniture always there, never asking too many questions, eventually someone might decide he was worth sounding out. Over weeks and months, that prediction began to come true. Regulars started to recognize him. A man who was always around but never seemed desperate for attention was less threatening. Occasionally, someone would mention having a piece of something to move a watch, some rings, a small amount of merchandise lifted from a truck. That was Donnie's opening. He would respond casually, indicating that he handled stuff like that, and offer a price that was fair but not generous enough to seem naive. If the seller agreed, Donnie made sure the transaction went smoothly. He paid promptly, did not haggle endlessly, and, crucially, did not talk out of school about where the goods went or who else he dealt with. Word spread in a small way. This Donnie character was a guy you could do business with. Behind the scenes, every piece of merchandise he acquired was carefully processed by the FBI. Serial numbers or identifying marks were recorded, and wherever possible, the items were traced back to specific thefts or hijackings. This allowed investigators to link particular individuals and locations to unsolved crimes, building cases that could later be brought in court. But on the street, none of that could show. Donnie's outward behavior had to be indistinguishable from that of a real fence. Any hint that stolen goods were vanishing into a government evidence room would have been fatal to the operation. During this period, he adhered to strict guidelines set by the Bureau and federal prosecutors. He was authorized to engage in certain limited criminal acts, primarily the receipt and resale of stolen property, when necessary to preserve his cover and move the investigation forward. More serious offenses, especially anything involving violence, were off limits. If situations threatened to cross that line, he had to find ways to sidestep them without making it appear that he was refusing on moral grounds. Sometimes that involved blaming outside commitments, claiming lack of resources, or simply steering conversations back toward the kind of deals he was supposedly best at: jewelry and other compact valuables. As Donnie's name became better known in these circles, doors that had previously been closed began to crack open. In the overlapping world of New York's underworld, many independent thieves and small crews paid a form of unofficial tribute to, or worked under the informal protection of, mafia figures. Some bars and clubs where Donnie now felt at ease were watched over by men whose last names and reputations were known to law enforcement from years of investigations: soldiers and associates of the Bonanno, Gambino, and other families. Getting noticed by them was risky, but also necessary. The FBI had not sent Pistone into the field just to dismantle a few truck hijacking rings. The long-term goal was always to reach the heart of a family. One of the first key figures from that world to take serious notice of Donnie Brasco was Anthony Tony Mira, a tough and volatile Bonanno family soldier with a long-standing reputation in Lower Manhattan. Mira had done time in prison and was known to be suspicious by nature, not the kind of man easily fooled or quickly impressed. His interest in Donnie grew out of practical considerations. Here was a man who seemed to be making money through theft and fencing without being obviously linked to any established crew. For a mafia soldier, bringing a useful outsider into the fold as an associate could mean additional income and increased standing. Mira began by testing Donnie in conversation, probing for inconsistencies. He wanted to know where Donnie was from, who he knew, what kinds of scores he had pulled in the past, and whether he had ever done time. Pistone had prepared thoroughly for moments like this. The backstory he had constructed for Donnie Brasco placed him as an Italian-American, raised in Paterson, familiar with the streets of New Jersey and New York, with a history of small-scale burglary and jewel theft, including work in Florida. These details matched what criminals in those regions might plausibly have seen or heard. He did not claim big dramatic exploits, which could be easily challenged, but instead described the kind of mid-level activity that rarely made headlines yet formed the real backbone of much property crime. Mira's questioning was not just about facts, it was about demeanor. In the underworld, how a man carried himself under scrutiny spoke volumes. Pistone had to remain calm without seeming rehearsed, respectful, without appearing intimidated. He could not bristle at uncomfortable questions, because real criminals were used to being grilled about their backgrounds. Over time, Mira appeared to accept him, at least provisionally. In the intricate social rules of La Cosa Nostra, this acceptance had specific meaning. Mira began to treat Donnie as his man, an associate who operated under his banner. This shift had immediate implications for the operation. Being identified as belonging to a particular soldier gave Donnie standing. Other criminals now knew that to deal with him was, in a sense, to deal with Mira. That made him more appealing as a business partner, since it suggested that he was not an isolated freelancer, but part of a recognized structure. It also increased the risk. If anything about Donnie later seemed suspicious, the embarrassment and potential danger would fall not only on him, but on Mira. who would be held responsible by his superiors for having vouched for an untrustworthy man. Through Mira, Donnie was introduced more directly to the world of the Bonanno family. He began spending time in social clubs and bars where Bonanno soldiers and associates gathered, places layered with unspoken rules. Seating arrangements, who poured whose drink, who spoke first in a conversation, these and other subtle cues indicated rank and alliances. Pistone had to absorb these signals quickly and react appropriately. Calling the wrong man boss, sitting in the wrong chair, or interrupting a higher-ranking figure could invite angry questions that might, in turn, lead to dangerous attention. At the same time, the FBI monitored his progress with a mixture of excitement and concern. Each new connection meant potential evidence and insight, but it also meant deeper entanglement. To maintain the integrity of the cases they hoped eventually to bring, his handlers needed detailed accounts of meetings, transactions, and conversations. Yet they could not insist on constant contact without jeopardizing his cover. Sometimes, days would pass without him checking in, during which he might be alone in a room with men whose capacity for retaliation was well known. Emergency procedures were in place, but the reality was stark. Much of the time, his safety depended on his own instincts and his ability to stay believable. His family felt the strain of this escalating commitment. As the operation intensified, he spent more and more time living the life of Donnie Brasco, often disappearing for days or weeks on end. When he returned home, he could not share even a fraction of what he had seen and done. The emotional distance created by secrecy and stress was difficult to bridge. His wife managed the household largely on her own, raising their 3 daughters while knowing only that their father was engaged in work that could put him in daily danger. Later accounts from Pistone highlight the guilt and worry that came with this double life. But at the time, he compartmentalized as best he could, reasoning that the best way to honor his responsibilities to his family was to survive and complete the mission. The underworld environment he now inhabited was not a series of stylized scenes, but a daily grind of small dealings, tense conversations, and constant evaluation. He saw how organized crime quietly influenced legitimate businesses. A construction company pressured to use certain suppliers. A trucking firm warned that using the wrong drivers could lead to problems. A restaurant owner persuaded to buy goods from specific distributors. These interactions were not always accompanied by overt threats, but the possibility of repercussions was understood. For Pistone, observing such things firsthand reinforced the broader purpose of his work. He was not merely infiltrating a subculture, he was documenting how that subculture extracted value and obedience from ordinary commerce. As months turned into years, new relationships formed, and existing ones evolved. Tony Mira's own position in the Bonanno family was not always stable. At various points, internal disputes and law enforcement pressure caused him to be less present. Into this shifting landscape stepped another man who would become central to Donnie Brasco's undercover life. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. Ruggiero was an experienced Bonanno soldier, older than Pistone, with decades of underworld experience behind him. He was known among his peers as talkative and impulsive, but also as someone deeply immersed in mafia life. Unlike some more distant or guarded figures, Ruggiero liked to explain things to share his opinions on people, rules, and events. For an undercover agent trying to understand the internal logic and language of La Cosa Nostra, this made him an invaluable, if unpredictable, companion. Their first sustained interactions grew out of business. Ruggiero had an ongoing need to recoup gambling losses and maintain a certain lifestyle, and someone like Donnie, who handled stolen jewelry and other valuables, could be a useful source of cash. As they conducted small deals, Pistone worked to present himself as dependable, modestly ambitious, and respectful. Over time, a personal rapport developed. Ruggiero began to see Donnie as both an ear for his frustrations and a potential asset to his standing in the family. He started to share stories, accounts of who had risen and fallen in the Bonanno hierarchy, explanations of why certain people were not to be trusted, and descriptions of how decisions were made. Pistone listened carefully, not only for incriminating details, but for insights into how mafiosi viewed themselves. He heard again and again about the concept of being a stand-up guy, someone who did not cooperate with law enforcement, who accepted the consequences of his actions without complaint, and who put the interests of the family above personal fear. The obligation of silence, the taboo against becoming an informant, was presented as almost sacred. For him, aware every moment that he was in fact an undercover agent gathering evidence, these conversations underscored the stakes. Exposure would not be treated as a minor betrayal. It would be seen as an unforgivable offense against the very core of their identity. Ruggiero also introduced Donnie more formally into the orbit of a key Bonanno capo, Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano. Napolitano controlled a crew based in Brooklyn and was considered a serious, disciplined leader within the family. His social club, the Motion Lounge, would become one of the central settings of the operation. But before Donnie could become a regular fixture there, he had to pass the unofficial tests of character and reliability imposed by men like Ruggiero and, indirectly, by the cautious observation of others in the crew. These tests were not staged confrontations so much as ongoing scrutiny. Was Donnie where he said he would be? Did he show up on time? Did he handle money responsibly? When minor disputes arose, did he lose his temper or keep his composure? Did he gossip about one man to another? Pistone's law enforcement training and personal temperament helped him here. He maintained a low-key demeanor, avoided unnecessary bravado, and consistently followed through on promises. The very qualities that had made him valuable to the FBI: discretion, patience, and reliability were now making him valuable in the eyes of the criminals he was targeting. Inside the FBI, each new layer of involvement was documented and analyzed. Prosecutors began to think about how evidence from this ongoing infiltration might be structured into future indictments. RICO allowed them to treat a pattern of related crimes as part of a single enterprise, rather than as isolated incidents. Pistone's undercover work could, in theory, provide the connective tissue, showing how illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and theft all flowed through the same hierarchy of decision-makers. Yet no one could say exactly when the operation should end. With each extension, the benefits and dangers both grew. The deeper Donnie went, the more he saw, and the more trust he earned. But the deeper he went, the more catastrophic it would be if something went wrong. Agents and supervisors debated timelines and exit strategies, but events on the street did not always align neatly with plans on paper. Mafia politics shifted, law enforcement pressure ebbed and flowed, and the personal relationships Pistone had cultivated took on a momentum of their own. By the late 1970s, the man who had once been a quiet boy in Patterson, a Navy intelligence specialist, a customs agent, and then a novice FBI undercover operative, was now embedded so deeply in the Bonanno family's day-to-day world that many mobsters truly saw him as one of their own. He had not yet reached the innermost circle. True membership in La Cosa Nostra remained reserved for men of Italian descent, who were formally made in a secret ceremony. But he was closer to that threshold than any federal agent had ever been. Every step toward that inner circle promised extraordinary intelligence for law enforcement, and every step also increased the peril he faced if the mask of Donnie Brasco ever slipped. By the time Joseph Pistone was spending most of his waking hours as Donnie Brasco in the social clubs and bars of New York, the boundaries between his real life and his undercover existence had thinned to a narrow line. What had begun as cautious contact with hijackers and fences had now become something more serious. He was functioning, day after day, as an associate in the orbit of the Bonanno crime family, with all the obligations and dangers that implied. The heart of this world, for him, was a small Brooklyn social club controlled by Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano, a Bonanno capo whose crew operated out of Williamsburg. The club, known as the Motion Lounge, did not look like much from the outside, just another modest storefront in a working-class neighborhood. Inside, however, it served as a kind of nerve center for Sonny Black's faction. Men drifted in and out throughout the day, drinking coffee or playing cards, taking calls, and discussing matters that ranged from sports scores and weather to loans, rackets, and the latest news from within the family. Pistone entered this environment under the wing of Benjamin "Lefty" Ruggiero, the seasoned soldier who had taken to Donnie and gradually assumed the role of teacher, sponsor, and, in some respects, surrogate older brother. Lefty brought Donnie around the Motion Lounge, introducing him to Sonny Black, and the other members of the crew, not as a stranger to be tolerated, but as my guy, someone worth knowing. In the careful social architecture of La Cosa Nostra, that introduction carried weight. It signaled that Lefty was willing to stake some of his reputation on this associate's reliability. Sonny Black was a very different personality from Ruggiero. Where Lefty could be talkative and emotional, Sonny Black tended to be quieter, controlled, and observant. He watched the men in his orbit closely, noting who arrived on time, who paid attention, and who kept their mouth shut when discretion was needed. As a capo, he was responsible for overseeing a range of illegal income streams, illegal gambling, loan sharking, protection schemes, and various sidelines, while maintaining discipline in his crew and managing relationships with other factions in the family. The FBI already knew his name from prior investigations, but Pistone would now see for himself how someone like Sonny Black actually ran a crew. In this setting, Donnie Brasco's role was modest. He showed up regularly, participated in card games, and made himself useful by running errands or handling small business matters. He did not try to impress anyone with wild stories or big promises. That restraint, once again, was deliberate. The men at the Motion Lounge had spent their lives around crooks of every variety. They could smell exaggeration and desperation. A man who seemed content to handle small deals and listen more than he spoke was easier to accept. Day by day, he learned the rhythms of the place. Mornings might begin with simple chatter: who owed what on last night's bets, whose cousin was in trouble, what was happening with the Yankees or the Mets. Gradually, conversations turned to collections that needed to be made, people who were behind on their payments, and new opportunities. Pistone observed how money flowed in, from gamblers paying off losses, from borrowers who had taken high-interest loans, from business owners who paid regular dues to ensure that their establishments were left alone. In each case, the underlying message was consistent. The crew provided a combination of access and protection. Those who cooperated could operate with fewer problems. Those who resisted might find business suddenly becoming very difficult. As his comfort level grew, Sonny Black and others began to trust Donnie with slightly more sensitive tasks. He might be asked to accompany Lefty on a visit to a debtor, or to be present when a new bookmaker came by to discuss terms. The intent was not necessarily to use him as muscle. He did not project that kind of physical intimidation, but to involve him in situations where the rules of the underworld were enforced. He was expected to stand by his associates, to present a united front, and to show that he understood what was at stake, even if he did not deliver the harsh words himself. Throughout this time, Pistone maintained the careful balancing act dictated by FBI guidelines. He could be present at discussions of illegal activity and, within defined limits, handle stolen property or cash connected to such activities, but he was required to avoid personally administering violence or initiating crimes. When situations threatened to cross a line, he relied on deflection and delay, claiming he had other obligations, steering conversations toward deals involving goods rather than confrontations, or suggesting that someone else was better suited for a particular task. The effectiveness of this strategy depended on the fact that in the criminal world, people often had their own priorities. If a man seemed useful and loyal in some respects, others might not push him too hard into areas where he professed less experience. Inside the FBI, each new development was carefully documented. After spending long hours or days as Donnie, Pistone would meet his handlers in safe locations to recount conversations and events, often in painstaking detail. These debriefings were crucial. The Bureau and federal prosecutors wanted to understand not only specific crimes, but the broader structure of the Bonanno organization, who reported to whom, how decisions were communicated, which crews controlled which neighborhoods or rackets. Over time, a detailed picture emerged, far more extensive than what could be gleaned from wiretaps alone. The FBI also deployed technical surveillance where possible. Some social clubs and meeting places connected to the operation were eventually equipped with listening devices authorized by court order. When these recordings were combined with Pistone's first-hand accounts, investigators could cross-check statements, clarify ambiguous references, and strengthen the evidentiary foundation for future prosecutions. Yet the technology had limitations. The men at the Motion Lounge were suspicious by nature, and they knew law enforcement valued hidden microphones. They sometimes spoke in guarded terms, used nicknames or coded phrases, or stepped outside for more sensitive discussions. In those moments, Pistone's presence as a trusted associate became even more important. As his reputation within Sonny Black's crew solidified, it had repercussions beyond day-to-day business. In the world of La Cosa Nostra, status was everything. Between full members, or made men, and the outside world existed a category of individuals known as associates. Associates were not formally inducted into the family. They had not gone through the clandestine ritual that marked a man's permanent commitment, but they could be deeply involved in the family's operations, earning money, sharing in certain decisions, and, in some cases, aspiring to eventual induction themselves. For an associate to move closer to that inner circle, he generally needed a sponsor, a made man willing to vouch for him. That sponsor might then bring the associate's name to higher-ups, arguing that he had shown loyalty, competence, and the qualities valued in a mobster. If the leadership agreed, the associate could eventually be proposed for membership, a step that, if accepted, led to full initiation. This was not purely symbolic. For those inside the system, being made conferred a kind of security and prestige, while also imposing strict obligations. Pistone, operating under the name of a man he had invented, found himself moving along this path. Lefty took every opportunity to remind others that Donnie was his man, a reflection of both pride and practical interest. If Donnie's stock rose, so might Lefty's. Over time, Sonny Black, too, began to see Donnie as an asset that could enhance the crew's earning power. The more Donnie brought in through jewelry deals or connections he claimed to have in Florida and elsewhere, the more he seemed like someone who could help the crew expand its reach. This growing value created friction with Anthony "Tony" Mira, the Bonanno soldier who had first brought Donnie into closer contact with the family's world. Mira, who had a reputation for volatility and a harsh temper, considered Donnie to be his associate by right of initial introduction. As Ruggiero and Sonny Black drew Donnie further into their sphere, Mira felt that his claim was being undermined. In the internal politics of the mafia, such disputes were not trivial. Associates represented potential income and influence. Losing one to another crew could be perceived as a loss of face. Arguments over who owned Donnie Brasco wound their way up the Bonanno chain of command. From Pistone's perspective, this was both perilous and revealing. He heard men he was deceiving debate his fate, as if he were a commodity to be allocated. At the same time, the fact that higher-ranking figures were spending time on the question indicated just how integrated he had become. Ultimately, the leadership decided in favor of Sonny Black's camp. Donnie would remain with the Napolitano crew, under Lefty's day-to-day guidance and Sonny's overall authority. Mira was told, in effect, to accept this outcome. This decision had consequences that would become more serious later, as grievances and suspicions accumulated. But in the immediate term, it cemented Pistone's place within one of the Bonanno family's key factions. He was now, in practical terms, a recognized Bonanno associate, answerable to a specific crew, expected to contribute to its success, and subject to its internal discipline. For Pistone, the psychological weight of this position was substantial. He had spent years cultivating relationships with men who now regarded him not merely as a casual contact, but as a trusted colleague. Lefty, in particular, had opened up to him in ways that went beyond business. Over endless cups of coffee and long car rides, Ruggiero shared complaints about his own life, his gambling habits that left him perpetually in debt, his frustration at feeling underappreciated after decades of service to the family, his strained relationships. He spoke proudly of being a wise guy, yet also revealed, sometimes unintentionally, the toll that such a life took: constant risk, the fear of betrayal, and the erosion of ordinary domestic stability. These conversations complicated Pistone's inner world. As an agent, he never lost sight of the fact that men like Ruggiero and Napolitano enforced a system that harmed countless people, from small business owners paying for protection to families burdened by impossible debts. Yet on a human level, it was difficult not to feel something for individuals whose loyalty to a criminal code had led them into a trap of their own making. Lefty, for all his bravado about how many violent acts he claimed to have committed, lived in a modest apartment, relied on the crew for financial support, and constantly worried about his standing. The myth of the glamorous mobster was steadily dismantled before Pistone's eyes. Meanwhile, the larger landscape of the Bonanno family was turbulent. Officially, Philip "Rusty" Rastelli was boss, but he spent much of the 1970s in prison on federal charges. In his absence, rival figures vied for power. Most notable among them was Carmine "Lilo" Galante, a fearsome mob leader who sought to dominate the family's narcotics trade and assert himself as the de facto boss. Galante's aggressive tactics and ambition unnerved other mafia leaders, who feared both increased law enforcement attention and disruption of the fragile balance among the New York families. Within the Motion Lounge and other gathering spots, Pistone heard the echoes of these high-level struggles. Men talked in cautious tones about Galante's moves, speculated on who stood with him and who remained loyal to Rastelli's faction, and worried about how any major shift might affect their own positions. The crew around Sonny Black generally aligned with the Rastelli camp, which put them on the opposite side of Galante. For an undercover agent, this internal conflict presented both risk and opportunity. It heightened tensions in the family, making men more alert to betrayal but also looser-tongued as they vented frustrations and anxieties. On the 12th of July 1979, Carmine Galante was murdered while having lunch at an Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, a killing widely understood to have been sanctioned by leaders within and beyond the Bonanno family, who saw him as a destabilizing force. Pistone was not present at the scene, but in the days and weeks that followed, he heard the ripples of the event. Conversations at the Motion Lounge took on a new tone. Some spoke of the killing with a kind of pragmatic approval, framing it as a necessary step to restore order and loyalty to the Rastelli-backed leadership. Others worried about the law enforcement spotlight that such a brazen act might attract. For the FBI, the elimination of Galante did not alter the fundamental direction of Pistone's operation, but it did confirm something they already suspected: that the Bonanno family was in a period of realignment, and that men like Sonny Black were likely to play increasingly prominent roles in the post-Galante structure. That made Pistone's position inside the Napolitano crew even more valuable. If Sonny's influence grew, so too would Donnie's access to information about the family's activities and plans. Through all of this, the mundane realities of undercover life continued. Pistone spent long hours in smoky rooms, listening to the same local gossip repeated, playing endless hands of cards, and enduring the minor indignities of a world where respect had to be demonstrated constantly in small ways. He could never fully relax. At any moment, someone might ask an unexpected question about his supposed past, test his knowledge of a person or place he claimed to know, or suddenly decide to pat him down in a paranoid search for a microphone. He developed habits to minimize risk, choosing clothes that concealed small recording devices when he wore them, positioning himself carefully in rooms, and always having a plausible explanation for any item someone might notice. His contact with his real family grew more sporadic. Holidays and birthdays might find him present in body, but distant in mind, preoccupied with the next meeting at the Motion Lounge or a pending trip arranged by Sonny Black. The Bureau provided support and counseling where it could, but there was no simple remedy for the strain of living two lives at once. In later reflections, Pistone acknowledged that the operation exacted a cost on his marriage and on his children's sense of their father's availability. At the time, however, the only way forward seemed to be deeper into the role he had agreed to play. By the end of the 1970s, Donnie Brasco was no longer just a name used to open doors in low-level criminal circles. He was, in the eyes of many Bonanno members and associates, a proven quantity, someone who had been around for years, who had shown up when needed, handled business competently, and kept his mouth shut about things that were not his concern. Within the internal logic of La Cosa Nostra, that made him a candidate for formal advancement. Quietly, conversations began about the possibility that Donnie might one day be straightened out, inducted as a full member. For the FBI, this was almost beyond imagining. The idea that a federal agent could be on the verge of becoming a made man in a mafia family. For Pistone, it meant that the stakes of his deception and the potential consequences if discovered had reached their highest point yet. As the 1970s turned into 1980, the name Donnie Brasco carried weight far beyond the narrow streets around the Motion Lounge in Brooklyn. What had started as a presence in a few New York bars had grown into a reputation that stretched down the eastern seaboard and into the Midwest, because the Bonanno family was not content to keep all of its activities within the city limits. Ambition in La Cosa Nostra often meant looking for new markets, new rackets, and new territories where alliances or pressure could turn local businesses into reliable sources of income. Wherever the Bonannos looked to plant a flag, there was a good chance they would send along the associate who had shown such a useful combination of nerve, apparent criminal skill, and discretion. Donnie. One of the most important arenas for this expansion was Florida. In the 1970s, Florida had become a magnet for migration, tourism, and investment. Retirees arrived in large numbers. Developers carved new neighborhoods out of swamps and scrubland, and the state's cities and suburbs swelled. Organized crime groups from the Northeast saw opportunity. The influx of money created demand for construction, entertainment, and vice. The growth in population created a larger base of potential customers for gambling, loans, and other rackets. The Tampa area, in particular, fell within the traditional sphere of influence of the Tampa Mafia family, led by Santo Trafficante Jr., a powerful boss with ties to other crime figures across the country. But that did not stop families from New York from trying to establish their own footholds, as long as they could negotiate an acceptable understanding with the local powers. For the Bonannos, one such foothold took shape around Pasco County, north of Tampa, in the form of a night spot that would be known as King's Court. The idea came together in the usual mixture of chance and calculation. Pistone, as Donnie, presented himself as someone who could put together a legitimate-looking business that would serve as a front for more profitable illegal activities, gambling, bookmaking, and whatever else might prove workable under local conditions. From the FBI's side, this was an ideal configuration. By backing the establishment through covert means, they could equip it with surveillance capabilities and ensure that whatever criminal activity was discussed within its walls would be well documented. Sonny Black and Lefty liked the prospect. Florida represented both a potential escape valve from mounting law enforcement pressure in New York and a chance to tap into a booming economy. They were not alone in that view. Other families, including the Gambinos and Genoveses, had their own Florida interests. But with Donnie available to serve as an on-the-ground operator, Sonny Black's crew believed they could carve out something under the Bonanno banner. Pistone made multiple trips to Florida, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by Ruggiero or other Bonanno associates. He lived there as Donnie, dealing with contractors, suppliers, and local contacts while maintaining regular phone contact with the Motion Lounge. On the surface, King's Court appeared to be a variation on what was sometimes called a bottle club, a venue that skirted certain liquor licensing restrictions by allowing patrons to bring their own alcohol and charging for membership, or mixers rather than drinks per se. In practice, it functioned as a social hub for locals and a meeting place for visiting mafiosi. As hoped, the club provided a controlled environment where the FBI could closely monitor interactions. Florida brought Pistone into contact not only with his Bonanno associates, but also with figures connected to Santo Trafficante's Tampa organization. In the tightly territorial world of La Cosa Nostra, no outside crew could simply begin conducting business in another family's backyard without acknowledgement. Introductions and negotiations were required. Meetings were held to feel out the intentions of these New Yorkers. The Tampa group wanted to know whether the Bonannos were merely looking for a place to invest modestly and run low-key operations, or whether they had designs on more substantial territory or rackets. These encounters were tense but revealing. For Pistone, standing in the middle of such discussions, there was a constant double awareness. On one level, he had to act as a loyal representative of Sonny Black's crew, explaining and justifying their plans, emphasizing that they meant to respect existing arrangements. On another level, he was observing the dynamics between two mafia families, the cautious testing of boundaries, the coded references to past understandings, the implicit threat that if agreements broke down, violence could follow. The FBI, listening in where possible and receiving his debriefings, gained an unusually clear window into how interfamily diplomacy worked in practice. At the same time, the Florida venture illustrated one of the persistent challenges of running a long-term undercover operation. the need to manage expectations without allowing suspicion to grow. Within the Bonanno crew, men like Lefty Ruggiero and Sonny Black expected concrete results. They wanted to see King's Court turn into a steady moneymaker, with gambling operations in the back rooms and perhaps even access to narcotics profits if reliable suppliers could be found. The Bureau, operating under strict rules, could not allow actual drug trafficking or large-scale illegal gambling to flourish under its own roof. That meant that some deals had to be slowed down, redirected, or allowed to die quietly. Pistone often found himself in the middle of these conflicting imperatives. He would speak with supposed drug sources or gambling partners, often undercover officers or informants controlled by law enforcement, and then report back to Sonny Black that there were unexpected delays, problems with supply, or worries about robberies that made conditions unfavorable. To the mobsters, this could feel like a string of bad luck or incompetence. Repeated disappointments could make them doubt the reliability of people Donnie had brought to the table. Each time a potential deal fell through, Pistone had to work to preserve Donnie's credibility, offering alternative opportunities, or taking on more direct responsibility to show that he was still driven to earn for the crew. Despite these frustrations, the Florida period further entrenched his status as a trusted operative. He was no longer seen merely as a New York street-level jewel thief. He was running a club, handling travel, managing contacts in another state, and acting for delicate interactions with another mafia family. That kind of responsibility was not entrusted to casual associates. The more the Bonannos relied on him in Florida, the more natural it seemed to them that his name would come up when lists of men suitable for formal induction were discussed back in New York. While Florida consumed a great deal of his time, it was not his only assignment beyond the 5 boroughs. Sonny Black had interests that stretched to the Midwest as well, particularly in the lucrative business of vending machines and jukeboxes. These seemingly mundane devices placed in bars, restaurants, and clubs could generate substantial income, especially when they were used for illegal gambling or when their placement contracts were secured through intimidation or collusion. Controlling which machines occupied which locations was a way of controlling a hidden stream of cash. In this arena, Pistone played a significant role in bridging the Bonanno family to the Milwaukee Mafia, led by boss Frank Balistrieri. Through his contacts and his plausible backstory as a man who could arrange machines and service, Donnie became the face of a business arrangement in which Bonanno-linked vending companies sought to place equipment in Wisconsin establishments under the protection and guidance of Balistrieri's organization. Negotiations revolved around percentages, territories, and responsibilities. Who would collect? Who would handle maintenance? How would disputes with bar owners be resolved? These talks, and the trips to Milwaukee that accompanied them, were enormously valuable to investigators. For the first time, the FBI had someone on the inside watching as 2 separate mafia families hashed out interstate business arrangements. The recordings and reports from these contacts helped establish the existence of an ongoing criminal enterprise that crossed state lines, a key element in federal racketeering prosecutions. Once again, Pistone had to perform a careful balancing act. He had to appear genuinely interested in the success of the venture and skilled in the details of the vending trade, while limiting the actual spread of criminal activity and ensuring that evidence was collected in a way that would stand up in court. The cumulative effect of these ventures was to weave Donnie Brasco deeply into the fabric of mafia cooperation and competition. By 1980, there were men in New York, Florida, and Wisconsin who all believed they knew him and depended on him in one way or another. The FBI, reviewing the broad tapestry of connections and evidence, could see that the operation had far surpassed its initial scope. What had begun as a way to get closer to hijackers and fences had become a direct line into the inner workings of multiple La Cosa Nostra families. Inside the Bonanno family, the internal power struggle that had exploded with the murder of Carmine Galante did not simply dissipate after his death. Previous resentments and ambitions remained. On one side was the Rastelli-aligned faction, which included Sonny Black and his allies, committed to maintaining Rusty Rastelli's authority even while he remained incarcerated. On the other side was a group of capos and associates who felt marginalized or opposed to Rastelli's leadership and sought to increase their own power. The names of these rival capos, Alphonse Sonny Red, Indelicado, Philip Phil Lucky Giacone, and Dominic Big Trin Trinchera circulated quietly in conversations at the Motion Lounge. Pistone, as Donnie, heard the worry and anger in these conversations. The men around Sonny Black believed that the other side was plotting to seize control of the family, and that hesitation or weakness could be fatal. The atmosphere grew more charged. Men were careful about where they went and whom they trusted. Rumors of planned meetings and potential ambushes circulated. For an undercover agent, this was both invaluable and deeply unsettling. He was listening to the early stages of decisions that could, and did, lead to lethal outcomes. In early 1981, tensions crystallized around a proposed sit-down, a meeting that was supposedly intended to clear the air between the rival factions. Members of Sonny Black's crew, including Lefty and others, prepared themselves with the understanding that it might be a trap, or that it might be an opportunity to strike first. Pistone was close enough to these men that he could not avoid hearing about the plans and sensing the dread beneath the bravado. He was, however, kept from direct participation at key moments, partly because his role as an associate made it unnecessary for him to be present at the highest-level confrontations, and partly because both he and the Bureau were determined to avoid a situation where he would be asked to take part in irreversible acts. On the 5th of May, 1981, in a Queens social club, the conflict reached its bloody climax when the three rebel capos were lured into a meeting and killed. Pistone was not at the scene. He learned about what had happened in the way that many associates did, in fragments of information, in sudden changes of mood at the Motion Lounge, in the abrupt disappearance of certain faces from the usual haunts. Before long, more concrete accounts emerged. The Rastelli faction had acted decisively. The internal threat to their control had been removed. For the FBI, this confirmed that the Bonanno family's inner circle, including men with whom Pistone was closely associated, were willing and able to sanction and carry out multiple murders to resolve internal disputes. It also meant that some of the men now most indebted to Donnie for years of loyal service were at the very center of some of the gravest crimes in the federal statute books. The potential for major RICO indictments grew with each passing month. So too did the unease among supervisors and prosecutors, who wondered how much longer they could safely leave an agent in the middle of such a volatile environment. The aftermath of the triple murders further elevated Sonny Black's standing. Having played a key role in securing the family for the Rastelli camp, he was seen, for a time, as a major power within the Bonanno organization. That increased his authority over his crew, and by extension, over Donnie Brasco. Inside the Motion Lounge, and in other gathering places, Sonny spoke with even greater confidence. Future plans were floated: additional moves in Florida, new business arrangements in New York, ways to strengthen the crew's earnings. He leaned on Donnie more heavily, viewing him as an essential earner and a man who had proven himself over years of proximity. It was in this climate of heightened trust and escalating stakes that the idea of formally straightening out Donnie surfaced more explicitly. Lefty Ruggiero, who had taken pride in shepherding Donnie through the ins and outs of mafia life, was particularly eager to see his protege become a made man. For Lefty, the sponsorship of a new member would have been both a personal triumph and a tangible acknowledgement of his long service. He spoke openly to Donnie about the process, how a man's name had to be put forward, how others would weigh his merits, how the ceremony itself closed to outsiders would mark a permanent change in status. Pistone listened, aware that every detail he absorbed was of enormous interest to law enforcement. Over the years, the FBI had gathered information from turncoats about initiation rituals, oaths, and symbols, but there was a difference between second-hand accounts and the prospect of having an agent walk up to the threshold of that world. Lefty's talk made clear just how far Donnie had come. Here was a veteran Bonanno soldier discussing, in matter-of-fact tones, the mechanics of opening the most guarded inner door to a man who, unbeknownst to him, was a sworn federal agent. As discussions advanced, Sonny Black signaled his support for the idea. The crew would, in time, put Donnie's name forward to the higher-ups. There was talk of a batch of new members being inducted, with Donnie among them. Specific dates were floated, then shifted, as leadership juggled prison schedules, law enforcement pressure, and internal considerations. Still, The trajectory was unmistakable. For the Bonannos, making Donnie would formalize a relationship that already felt, in many respects, like membership in everything but name. For the FBI, allowing the process to reach its conclusion carried profound ethical and practical questions. If he was formally inducted, Pistone would be present during a ceremony in which he would be asked to swear lifelong allegiance to a criminal organization and to accept the rules and penalties that came with that pledge. While he had no intention of honoring such an oath, the symbolism would be strong, and the optics in public and in court could be complicated. What did it mean for the government to allow one of its agents to participate, even as a deception, in the most sacred ritual of La Cosa Nostra? How would jurors and the public react to the knowledge that the FBI had permitted an agent to cross that line in pursuit of larger investigations? Debate intensified in FBI offices and the Department of Justice. Some argued that the unparalleled intelligence to be gained from witnessing and documenting such a ceremony, and from the increased trust Donnie would enjoy afterward, justified the risk. Others insisted that a boundary had to be drawn. Undercover work could go far, but not to the point of full symbolic assimilation into the very structure the law sought to dismantle. Meanwhile, on the street, events continued to move at their own pace, indifferent to the deliberations of bureaucrats. For Pistone himself, the prospect of being made brought mixed feelings. On a practical level, deeper acceptance would increase his ability to gather information and influence events. On a personal level, the idea of standing in a room with Sonny Black, Lefty, and others, with all of them convinced that they were welcoming him permanently into their brotherhood, was deeply unsettling. He knew that whenever the operation ended, those same men would learn that the man they had believed to be their loyal associate had, in reality, been working against their organization for years. The sense of betrayal they would feel was likely to be intense, and the consequences for them would be severe. Already, he struggled with the knowledge that men who had confided in him might one day face long prison terms because of the evidence he was gathering. Even as this moral and operational dilemma sharpened daily life as Donnie Brasco went on, he still spent hours in the motion lounge, still traveled to Florida when required, still opened conversations in which debts were discussed and payments arranged. He still sat across from men who, without hesitation, referred to serious violence as one tool among many for resolving disputes, even if they did not dwell on the details. In those rooms, the boundaries between legal and illegal, between acceptable pressure and criminal coercion, were taken for granted. For Pistone, the job was to register and record, not to intervene. The time for action would come later, when handcuffs were applied and arrest sweeps and indictments unsealed in federal courtrooms. As 1981 progressed, the convergence of factors became harder to ignore. The Bonanno family, though newly stabilized under the Rastelli faction, remained under scrutiny. The internal bloodletting had drawn attention. Federal prosecutors, armed with RICO, were increasingly ready to bring sweeping cases. The FBI's undercover agent stood poised on the edge of an unprecedented step. The tension between continuing the operation to its ultimate potential and extracting their agent before the risks became unacceptable reached a critical point. Outside the bars and social clubs where Donnie Brasco was a daily presence, decisions were being made in Washington and in New York offices that would soon force an end to one of the most audacious, undercover infiltrations in American law enforcement history. In the summer of 1981, the double life that Joseph Pistone had been living for nearly 6 years reached a point where it could not continue much longer. On the streets, as Donnie Brasco, he was more deeply embedded than ever. Inside the Bonanno family, talk of formally inducting him as a made man was no longer vague speculation. It was an expectation being discussed by men like Lefty Ruggiero and Sonny Black Napolitano as an almost inevitable next step. Inside the FBI and the Department of Justice, however, the mood was shifting. Prosecutors and senior agents could see that the operation had produced a mountain of evidence and unprecedented access. They could also see that every additional week in the field increased the danger to their agent and complicated the moral and legal questions surrounding his role. Meetings in New York and Washington brought together organized crime supervisors, case agents, and federal prosecutors. They spread out transcripts, debriefing notes, surveillance reports, and organizational charts, tracing how Pistone's work had mapped the Bonanno hierarchy and its business dealings in New York, Florida, Wisconsin, and beyond. They weighed the quantity and quality of evidence that could be brought into court under RICO statutes. Records of illegal gambling operations, loan sharking schemes, extortionate practices, and discussions implicating members and associates in killings and internal conspiracies. By any conventional measure, the operation had already exceeded expectations. What remained open to debate was whether the potential benefits of continuing could justify the mounting risks. One major concern was the very thing that had once seemed the operation's ultimate prize, the prospect of Pistone being made. Allowing a federal agent to go through a mafia initiation ceremony might yield extraordinarily detailed, first-hand testimony about the most secretive ritual in La Cosa Nostra. It might also create serious complications. Defense attorneys could argue in court that the government had gone too far, crossing a line from infiltration into symbolic participation in their client's organization. Jurors might be troubled by the image of an FBI agent standing in a room, reciting words of allegiance, even if everyone involved understood that the allegiance was feigned. Internally, some officials worried about the message it would send to other agents about what was permissible in undercover work. There was also the question of what further exposure really remained to be gained. After nearly 6 years in the field, Pistone had documented the Bonanno structure in far more detail than any agent before him. He had been present as men discussed resolving disputes, dividing money, punishing disobedience, and reorienting the family after internal power struggles. He had personally helped establish or negotiate ventures in Florida and the Midwest. The broad picture was clear. The marginal information that might be gathered from another 6 months or a year of undercover work had to be weighed against the reality that discovery, if it came now, would put him in the middle of a group of men who felt they had staked their reputations and lives on his loyalty. On the street, he could sense some of this tension even without seeing the memoranda and meetings behind it. He knew he was closer than ever to being formally proposed for membership. Lefty spoke about it with pride and impatience, hinting that the next batch of inductions would almost certainly include Donnie. Sonny Black treated him with increasing deference, drawing him into more serious conversations and expecting his presence at important meetings. At the same time, Pistone felt the strain of his long absence from any normal life. 6 years of living as someone else, of constantly monitoring his words and actions, had taken a cumulative toll that he could feel in his body and mind. When the Bureau made its decision, they did not announce it with any fanfare. His handlers asked for a meeting away from the clubs and bars where Donnie Brasco usually passed his time. In a quiet room, removed from the noise of the underworld, they told him what had been decided at the higher levels. The operation would be shut down. He had to come out. Pistone did not accept this immediately or passively. He argued that he was on the verge of reaching a point no agent had ever reached, that with a little more time, he could witness an induction ceremony, gain an even higher level of trust, and perhaps uncover further plots and connections. His superiors listened, but they had already made their calculations. They emphasized the volume of evidence already gathered, the growing instability within the Bonanno family, and the potential for things to spiral quickly beyond anyone's control if the operation continued. They reminded him that his own safety, and that of his family, could not be treated as an afterthought. In the end, as an agent operating within the chain of command, he accepted the decision. It did not make the emotional reality any easier. The directive meant that without warning to the people who knew him only as Donnie, he would disappear. There would be no chance to say goodbye to Lefty, no careful explanation to Sonny Black. One day he would be a daily presence at the Motion Lounge. The next, he would be gone, leaving behind only unanswered questions. Questions that, in time, would be answered for those men in the harshest possible way. His last days as Donnie were marked by an odd mix of routine and quiet farewell. He still showed up at the club, still played cards, still listened to talk about collections and new opportunities. Inside, though, he was acutely aware that each conversation might be the last he would ever have with these people. He watched Lefty complain about his gambling debts and boast about his underworld credentials, unaware that within weeks, his world would be turned upside down. He sat across from Sonny Black, as the capo discussed future plans for Florida and beyond, still expecting Donnie to be at his side in implementing them. Then, on a day set by his handlers, he simply did not go back. Donnie Brasco vanished from the streets of New York and Florida. To the Bonanno family, it was at first a puzzle. Men who worked dangerous jobs did occasionally disappear, for reasons that were not sinister arrests in other jurisdictions, sudden flights to avoid debts, or simply decisions to walk away. But in a world where betrayal was never far from mind, unexplained absence soon took on a darker possible meaning. The FBI, meanwhile, shifted into the next phase of its plan. Now that its undercover agent was out of immediate danger, the Bureau began preparing a series of coordinated arrests and indictments based on years of accumulated evidence. Federal prosecutors worked closely with case agents to assemble charges that would not only target individuals, but demonstrate the existence of an organized criminal enterprise. They traced financial flows, linked recorded conversations to specific events, and incorporated Pistone's eyewitness accounts into broader narratives of criminal conduct. Even before any arrests were made, however, the Bureau understood that its sudden removal of Donnie would not go unnoticed for long in Bonanno circles. They decided that it was better to control the way the truth emerged than to allow rumors and partial information to breed even more suspicion and potentially lead to wider violence. Agents from the New York office sought out key figures, including Lefty Ruggiero and Sonny Black Napolitano, and confronted them directly with the reality they would have preferred never to hear. Accounts from that period describe agents meeting with Sonny Black at his club and with Lefty in other locations, laying out photographs and documents that showed Brasco in a context that could not be explained away, pictures of him being congratulated by federal officials, records showing his status as an FBI agent. For men who prided themselves on being able to read people, on spotting informants and undercover cops before they got too close, the revelation was a deep humiliation. They had vouched for Donnie, had introduced him into the family's business, had discussed sensitive matters in front of him. Now, they were being told that for 6 years, the Bonanno family had been harboring a government agent in its inner circle. Within La Cosa Nostra's code, failing to detect an infiltrator was not a minor oversight. It was seen as an unforgivable lapse in judgment and vigilance. Responsibility had to be assigned, and punishment meted out, not only to demonstrate that the family could still police itself, but to reassure other families that such a breach would not be shrugged off. The focus quickly narrowed to those who had most openly vouched for Donnie, Sonny Black, and, to a somewhat lesser extent, Lefty. The decision about what to do with Sonny Black came from above. As a capo who had embraced Donnie, included him in high-level meetings, and spoken glowingly of his potential as a made man, Napolitano was held accountable for the breach. Later, in the late summer of 1981, he was told to report to a meeting. He went, knowing, by all later indications, that the summons was ominous. Shortly afterward, he disappeared. His body would not be found until the following year. But within the world he had inhabited, his fate was understood. He had been killed as punishment for bringing an undercover agent into the family. Lefty's position was more complicated. As a soldier, he had been the one to teach Donnie the ways of the mafia, to travel with him, to argue passionately for his induction. Within the Bonanno structure, that made him culpable in the eyes of some higher-ups. He too was told to report to a meeting, a summons that, in the logic of the underworld, often meant a man would not be coming home. On the day he was due to attend, however, FBI agents intercepted him. They arrested him on charges stemming from the very activities they had monitored during the Brasco operation, and in doing so almost certainly saved his life. Because he was in federal custody, the family could not easily reach him. These events underline a stark truth about undercover work at that level. When an agent succeeds in penetrating a tight-knit criminal organization, the people most directly harmed by that success are often the very individuals who extended trust and sponsorship to the undercover identity. Pistone, safely removed from the streets now, learned in due course what had happened to Sonny Black and what had nearly happened to Lefty. He understood intellectually that their choices and actions had led them into a world where such outcomes were always a risk. Yet on a human level, the knowledge was heavy. These were men with whom he had shared countless hours, who had spoken candidly to him about loyalty and betrayal, without suspecting that he was gathering evidence that would contribute to their downfall. For the Bonanno family as a whole, the exposure of the Donnie Brasco operation was a major blow. Other New York families looked at them with a mixture of alarm and scorn. Having an FBI agent functioning as an associate for 6 years within your ranks was not just a security failure. It was an embarrassment in a culture that prided itself on keeping outsiders at bay. In practical terms, the family's influence within the commission, the informal governing council of the American Mafia, was weakened. Combined with the internal killings and leadership disputes of the previous years, the Brasco affair contributed to a period during which the Bonannos were regarded as unstable and compromised. For Pistone and his family, the end of the operation did not bring instant peace. With his cover blown and his face known to dozens of men who now had powerful reasons to resent him, he and his wife and daughters had to be placed under protective measures. They were moved, their routines disrupted, their sense of normalcy shattered. The Bureau and the U.S. Marshals Service implemented security protocols, including changes of residence and, where necessary, new identities. The threat was not hypothetical. Reports indicated that a substantial contract had been placed on his life by mafia figures enraged at the damage his work had inflicted. In this new phase, Pistone returned fully to his original name and status. In one respect, he was once again openly an FBI agent. But the experience of stepping back into his real identity after so many years of living as someone else was disorienting. He had to remember, in a sense, how to be Joseph rather than Donnie in everyday interactions. He no longer needed to calibrate every word for fear of accidentally revealing a detail that did not fit his fictional background. But the habit of constant vigilance did not disappear overnight. Simple things, like introducing himself to a neighbor or writing his name on a form, carried an echo of the years when such acts had been fraught with danger. Almost immediately, his role shifted from covert operative to key witness. Federal prosecutors preparing cases against Bonanno members and associates needed him to walk them through the tangled web of conversations, deals, and relationships he had witnessed. He spent long hours in conference rooms, going back over names, dates, and places, matching his recollections to recorded tapes and other documentary evidence. Where a transcript showed a fragmentary conversation laced with slang and half-finished sentences, Pistone could explain what the participants had meant, what prior events they were referring to, and how the exchange fit into the larger pattern of the family's activities. When indictments were unsealed, they reflected the scale of the operation he had helped build. Dozens of defendants from the Bonanno family, and in some related cases, figures from other families were charged with offenses ranging from racketeering and conspiracy to specific acts of extortion and illegal gambling. The precise numbers would be tallied differently in different accounts, but it is broadly accepted that Pistone's undercover work contributed to more than 200 federal indictments and over 100 convictions across a series of trials. Those figures represent far more than headlines. They translate into years and decades behind bars for men who had previously operated for long stretches with relative impunity. In courtrooms, he faced a different kind of test. On the witness stand, in front of judges, juror, defense attorneys, and the defendants themselves, he recounted years of infiltration without the protective mask of Donnie Brasco. Defense counsel probed for inconsistencies, searched for signs of overreach, and suggested that his role had been too deeply embedded, that he had become part of the underworld he was supposed to be investigating. Prosecutors countered by emphasizing the legal and procedural safeguards under which he had operated, and the level of supervision and documentation that accompanied his work. Pistone's calm, matter-of-fact demeanor under questioning strengthened the government's cases. He was able to explain the internal vocabulary of La Cosa Nostra, the meaning of terms like making your bones, stand-up guy, and earn, in ways that allowed jurors with no exposure to that world to understand what defendants were discussing on tapes and in conversations. He showed how seemingly casual barroom talk was, in reality, the language of an entrenched criminal enterprise. The fact that he had been sitting at those bar tables, that he had watched money change hands and seen orders passed down, gave his explanations a weight that purely academic or second-hand testimony could not match. The The trials that followed over the early and mid-1980s helped to cement a shift in the government's war on organized crime. RICO, once a relatively untested legal tool, was now being used aggressively to target entire organizations, not just individual offenders. The success of the Brasco-related prosecutions demonstrated that with patient, deeply embedded undercover work and careful use of electronic surveillance, law enforcement could pierce the mafia's code of silence. For younger agents and prosecutors coming into the field, Pistone's story became a kind of case study in what was possible, and in the personal costs that such operations demanded. As verdicts came down and sentences were handed out, Joseph Pistone watched from a position unlike that of any other witness in those rooms. He had sat with some of the defendants as they made plans and confided fears, and now he watched them hear the words that would take them away for long stretches. He did not celebrate. By his own later accounts, the moment was more somber than triumphant. He believed firmly that dismantling the mafia's grip on communities was a necessary public good. He also knew that the people being led away were, in some cases, men who had treated him as a friend, however misguided their values and actions had been. Beyond the individuals and trials, the impact of the Donnie Brasco operation on the Bonanno family's standing was profound. The exposure of their internal business and the imprisonment of key figures damaged their ability to present themselves as an untouchable force. Combined with parallel efforts against other families culminating in the famous commission case of the mid-1980s, the Brasco investigation helped usher in a period where the New York Mafia's influence and cohesion were significantly weakened. The organization did not evaporate. Criminal enterprises rarely disappear entirely, but the aura of invulnerability that had surrounded La Cosa Nostra for much of the 20th century was irrevocably cracked. For Pistone personally, the end of the courtroom phase did not mean a return to quiet anonymity. His name, once strictly protected, began to circulate more widely as the public learned about the extent of the operation. He would go on to write about his experiences and to consult on efforts to train other officers in undercover techniques. But those developments belong to a later chapter. In the early years after his extraction, he was still, in many ways, an agent coming down from an extraordinary assignment, living under protection, testifying in case after case, and coming to terms with the legacy of 6 years spent inhabiting a role that had taken him closer to the heart of organized crime than any law enforcement officer before him. When the courtroom lights dimmed and the last major cases connected to his undercover work were concluded, Joseph Pistone found himself in a strange kind of limbo. For 6 years he had lived almost entirely as Donnie Brasco, and for several more he had relived those years in meticulous detail on witness stands and in conference rooms. Now the formal obligations of the investigation, daily debriefings, strategy sessions with prosecutors, rounds of cross-examination, began to taper off. The FBI still had use for him, but the role he had played so completely could no longer be his everyday life. He had to learn, in middle age, how to be a different kind of agent, and how to be a more present husband and father, while still living under the shadow of men who had sworn to see him dead. The Bureau did not simply cut him loose. After the scale of the operation and the publicity it began to attract in law enforcement circles, there was a clear understanding that the Mafia's anger was not going to dissipate quickly. Reports indicated that a large contract, often cited as $500,000, had been placed on his head, an enormous sum in the underworld economy. He had spent years in the company of men for whom such a contract was more than just a figure of speech. They had talked casually about setting up ambushes, arranging disappearances, and settling scores. He knew what it meant when someone became a target of that magnitude. Protection protocols reflected that reality. The Bureau and U.S. Marshals Service arranged for his family to move, their address and daily habits shielded as much as possible. Neighbors in new towns were not told why their quiet, unassuming neighbor sometimes seemed unusually cautious, or why he avoided unnecessary attention. He and his wife took steps to blend in, raising their daughters in an environment meant to feel ordinary even as layers of security underpinned it. The girls, having grown up with a father whose work often took him away for long stretches without clear explanations, now had to cope with the knowledge that his job had placed all of them in a kind of continuing jeopardy. Emotionally, the adjustment was uneven. On one hand, leaving the undercover life meant an end to the constant improvisation and fear of exposure. He no longer had to monitor every word to ensure it fit a fictional biography. He could walk into a restaurant without scanning for familiar underworld faces. On the other hand, the habits born of 6 years in close proximity to dangerous men did not vanish. He kept his back to walls when possible, watched entrances and exits instinctively, and assessed strangers with an eye trained to notice inconsistencies. For a time, even the sound of a certain accent or a particular style of dress could trigger a reflexive evaluation: friend, foe, or unknown. Within the FBI, he shifted into roles that took advantage of his unique experience. Long-term undercover work had always been part of the Bureau's toolkit, but no previous operation had gone so deep into La Cosa Nostra or lasted as long. Younger agents and supervisors wanted to know how he had managed it, how he built and maintained a cover story, how he coped with the psychological strain, and how he navigated daily contact with criminals while staying within the bounds imposed by law and Bureau policy. He began giving internal briefings, walking rooms full of agents through the practicalities of cultivating criminal contacts, earning their trust, and staying alert to the subtle signs that someone suspected a ruse. These sessions were not heroic monologues. They were, by all accounts, grounded and unsentimental. He emphasized that undercover work was not for everyone, that it demanded an unusually high degree of self-control, patience, and tolerance for isolation. He spoke about the importance of supervision and clear lines of authority, of never losing sight of the fact that an agent's first duty was to the law and to the public, no matter how close he or she might seem to be with targets in the field. At a time when law enforcement culture still sometimes romanticized toughness and swagger, his example underlined that the most effective work often came from careful listening and emotional discipline, rather than from displays of machismo. Outside the Bureau, news of what he had done began to seep gradually into the public sphere. In the first years after his extraction, much of the information about the Brasco operation came in fragments, references in indictments, brief mentions in press accounts of organized crime trials, rumors traded among reporters who covered the federal courts. As the cases concluded, and the danger of compromising ongoing investigations receded, the picture sharpened. Here was a man who had spent more than half a decade inside a mafia family under a false name, contributing to scores of convictions. Even stripped of embellishment, the bare facts had a cinematic quality that drew attention. Journalists and publishers approached him with requests to tell the story in a more organized way. There were obvious benefits to doing so. A detailed account could help the public understand what organized crime actually looked like at street level, how it infiltrated businesses, unions, and neighborhoods without the stylization that films and novels often brought to the subject. It could also, more pragmatically, allow him to support his family in a period when his career, though still within the FBI, had been knocked off the conventional track by the demands of security and the notoriety of his undercover identity. Writing about an operation like Brasco's posed its own challenges. Much of what he had done was still sensitive. Names of informants, specific investigative techniques, and certain still ongoing matters could not be exposed without putting people at risk or undermining other cases. He also understood that anything he published would be read not only by law enforcement and the general public, but by surviving figures in organized crime who would be eager to parse his words for insight into what he had and had not known, and how he had seen them. The solution was to work with professional writers and with the Bureau and Department of Justice to ensure that the narrative was accurate, while scrupulous about protecting necessary secrets. The result was the book that would cement his public identity. Donnie Brasco, My Undercover Life in the Mafia, written with journalist and author Richard Woodley, and published in the late 1980s. In it, he laid out his progression from working-class New Jersey kid to FBI agent to undercover operative, describing in plain language the day-to-day reality of life inside the Bonanno family. The book did not present the mob as glamorous or admirable. Instead, it showed the pettiness, the financial anxieties, the constant jockeying for position, and the corrosive effects of a life lived in fear of betrayal. It also exposed the cost to his own family and psyche, refusing to pretend that such an operation could be pulled off without significant personal consequence. Readers responded strongly. For some, The book confirmed things they had suspected about organized crime's ordinariness, that it was less a world of grandiose schemes and more a relentless grind of small-time coercion and jockeying over percentages. For others, the narrative of a lone agent embedded for years among dangerous men, always one mistake away from disaster, had a compelling, almost unbelievable intensity. Law enforcement professionals mined it for lessons, while ordinary readers were struck by the level of detail about how social clubs worked, how introductions were made, and how the rules of La Cosa Nostra were enforced in practice. Almost inevitably, Hollywood took notice. The film industry had long been fascinated with mafia stories, from the stylized family saga of The Godfather to grittier portraits like Mean Streets. But those films, however well-researched, had been shaped primarily by imaginative interpretation, novels, or short-term journalistic observation. Now there was a chance to adapt a story rooted directly in the experience of an agent who had sat at the tables, ridden in the cars, and listened to the monologues of real, named, mob figures. Producers acquired the rights to his story, and over the course of the early and mid-1990s, a film adaptation slowly took shape. Scripts were drafted and revised, directors came and went, and cast lists shifted. Pistone himself, though not a filmmaker, remained involved as a consultant, answering questions about how men in that world would likely speak, dress, and react in given situations. He insisted, as much as his influence allowed, that the film avoid romanticizing the lifestyle he had spent years helping to dismantle. The point, for him, was not to turn Ruggiero, Napolitano, or any other figure into tragic heroes, but to show how loyalty, twisted by a criminal code, led to paranoia, betrayal, and, often, violent ends. When the film Donnie Brasco was finally released in 1997, directed by Mike Newell and starring Johnny Depp as the undercover agent and Al Pacino as a character based on Lefty Ruggiero, it brought Pistone's story to a global audience, in a way no court testimony or book could. The movie dramatized certain events and compressed timelines, as films do, but it adhered to the broad contours of what had happened. A young agent embeds himself in a mafia crew, wins the trust of an aging soldier, watches as internal power struggles play out around him, and ultimately contributes to the legal dismantling of the world he had infiltrated. Pistone, watching the finished film, could see where artistic license had been taken and where reality had been condensed for narrative effect. Yet he also recognized moments that rang true. The long, repetitive days in social clubs, the sudden shifts from banter to serious talk, the way misguided loyalty could bind men to a destructive system. The portrayal of his relationship with the Lefty character captured in its own way the strange bond that had developed between agent and mobster, a relationship built on shared time and mutual reliance, yet underscored by a fundamental, hidden betrayal. The film's success carried both opportunities and complications. On one hand, it amplified the educational impact of his work. Viewers who might never read a detailed nonfiction account came away with a sense that the mafia was not all style and power, but also sadness, waste, and constant fear. The movie's reach gave Pistone a platform to speak more widely about organized crime, the realities of undercover work, and the importance of resisting the mythologizing of criminal organizations. On the other hand, increased visibility also meant renewing, at least for a time, public interest in his whereabouts and private life. Attention that did not always sit comfortably with someone who had spent much of his career trying not to be noticed. Throughout this period, he continued to participate in training efforts for law enforcement agencies, not only in the United States, but abroad. Police forces in countries facing their own struggles with organized crime, terrorism, or entrenched corruption were keen to learn from a man who had successfully navigated a years-long deep cover assignment. He traveled, under controlled conditions, to speak with investigators in Europe, Latin America, and elsewhere, tailoring his insights to different cultural and legal contexts. While no other operation would be an exact replica of Brasco, the underlying principles, patient relationship building, careful documentation, clear ethical boundaries, had broad applicability. Within these professional circles, his story also sparked important debates. Some officers and legal scholars questioned whether operations of such duration and depth should be repeated. They pointed to the psychological toll on operatives, the risk of agents becoming too sympathetic to their targets, and the ethical dilemmas raised when undercover officers witness criminal planning, but are constrained in how they can intervene without blowing their cover. Others countered that, in certain contexts, such operations were the only way to penetrate organizations that relied on fear, secrecy, and tight social bonds to shield themselves from conventional investigative tools. Pistone himself tended to acknowledge the force of both sides. He did not present his experience as a template that should be imposed indiscriminately, but as an example of what could be done when leadership, legal frameworks, and an agent's particular skills aligned. He consistently stressed the importance of strong oversight of supervisors and prosecutors who were engaged, who understood the operation's goals, and who were prepared to pull the plug if lines were in danger of being crossed. In that sense, his story was not simply inspirational, it was cautionary, a reminder that effectiveness in law enforcement must always be balanced against the principles it is meant to uphold. Away from public appearances and training sessions, he tried to keep his personal life deliberately quiet. He has, over the years, declined to share many details about his family, preferring to shield them from curiosity and potential backlash. What he has said indicates that the years of the operation and its aftermath were hard on his marriage and children, forcing them to live with uncertainty, absence, and then the burden of a sudden, unwelcome kind of fame. The fact that he chose to write and speak openly about his work did not erase his sense that they, too, had paid a price for decisions made in FBI offices far from their home. Within the Bureau, his official career drew to a close in the late 1980s. After 17 years of service, including the extraordinary stretch as Donnie Brasco, he retired from the FBI. Retirement, however, did not mean disappearing from the world of law enforcement. As a consultant, author, and speaker, he remained deeply engaged with efforts to understand and combat organized crime. He worked on additional books, including one focused on the psychological landscape of the mobster mindset and another on the practicalities of undercover work, each aimed in part at demystifying a world still prone to being glamorized. Meanwhile, the landscape of organized crime itself was evolving. The successful use of RICO statutes in the 1980s and early 1990s, combined with operations like Brasco's and the high-profile commission trial that targeted the leadership of several New York families, weakened La Cosa Nostra's centralized power. The old line bosses aged, died, or went to prison. Younger generations, facing a law enforcement environment better equipped with informants, wiretaps, and undercover experience, struggled to sustain the same level of influence over industries and unions. New criminal organizations, some ethnically based, others rooted in transnational drug trafficking or emerging cybercrime, rose to prominence. Pistone watched these changes with a clear sense of continuity. In his view, the specific names and structures might shift, but the underlying dynamics remained. Wherever large sums of money could be extracted through intimidation, fraud, or the manipulation of legitimate businesses, organized crime in some form would seek to move in. The challenge for law enforcement was to adapt its methods without losing sight of the human factors that had allowed an operation like Brasco's to succeed. Understanding the cultures of criminal groups, recognizing the social and economic conditions that fed them, and cultivating officers capable of operating calmly in morally ambiguous spaces without losing their bearings. If there was a single thread running through his public reflections in these years, it was a commitment to stripping away romance from the image of the mob. He returned repeatedly to the idea that, for all their talk of honor and brotherhood, the men he had met were trapped in a cycle of fear and exploitation. They harmed others and, in many cases, ended up destroying their own families and futures. The aging soldier in a small apartment, dependent on the whims of bosses and the uncertain flow of illicit earnings, loomed larger in his accounts than the rare, more visibly wealthy Don. He wanted young people thinking about crime not to see the polished suits and shiny cars, but the loneliness of a life where trust was always conditional, and where a single suspected betrayal could erase decades of service. The combination of books, film, and training work made him one of the most widely recognized figures in the history of American undercover operations. That status was never something he had sought as a young agent. When he first walked into New York bars as Donnie Brasco, his goal had been to gather evidence quietly, not to become the subject of movies and international lectures. Yet once the operation's scale and impact became known, anonymity was no longer an option. He chose to lean into the role carefully, using the platform to reinforce messages about the realities of organized crime and the discipline required of undercover agents, rather than to bask in a mythologized version of what he had done. Through it all, the core facts of his life remained the same. He was a man born to working-class parents in Erie and raised in the tough neighborhoods of Patterson, a Navy veteran, a former school teacher and customs agent, an FBI operative who had taken on one of the riskiest assignments ever attempted by the Bureau, a husband and father who had asked his family to endure years of upheaval for the sake of a cause they could not fully share in until much later. That complexity resists simple categorization, and in his later years he seemed determined not to let his story be reduced to a single dramatic arc. The undercover agent, the courtroom witness, the author, the trainer, they were all facets of a life shaped, for better and worse, by the long stretch of time he had spent answering not to the name Joe, but to the carefully crafted fiction of Donnie Brasco. In the years after his retirement from the FBI, as the legal dust from the Bonanno prosecution settled and other cases took center stage in the headlines, Joseph Pistone's story did not fade the way many law enforcement careers do. Instead, it evolved. What had once been a tightly guarded operational secret, known only within a small circle of agents, prosecutors, and judges, gradually became part of the broader historical record of how the United States had confronted organized crime in the late 20th century. He, in turn, shifted from being an operative in the field to being a kind of living archive, someone who carried in his memory details that no case file, no matter how thick, could fully capture. His first book had laid out the broad arc of his undercover years, but as time passed and he grew more comfortable reflecting on the experience, he returned to the page to explore facets that he felt had been underdeveloped or misunderstood. In 2004, he published The Way of the Wise Guy, a shorter volume that distilled some of what he had learned about the mentality and daily reality of men in La Cosa Nostra. Rather than retelling the entire operation, he focused on attitudes and patterns, how mobsters thought about money, handled fear, justified their actions, and navigated relationships in a world where a friendly arm around the shoulder could turn, without warning, into a sentence of death. The intent was not to glamorize, but to demystify, to show that beneath the stylized mythology of honor and codes were very human insecurities and rationalizations. 3 years later, in Donnie Brasco, Unfinished Business, written with attorney and author Charles Brandt, he expanded on episodes and angles that had received less attention in the first memoir. This second book delved more deeply into some of the peripheral operations, into his interactions with other families beyond the Bonannos, and into parts of the story that could not be safely or legally told in the late 1980s. By then, many of the figures involved were dead or had long since been convicted and sentenced. The additional distance allowed for a fuller exploration of what had unfolded, including more candid discussions of tensions within the FBI and the emotional toll the operation had exacted on everyone involved, on both sides of the law. As his narrative entered the public domain in these fuller forms, it inevitably attracted scrutiny as well as admiration. Some former mobsters and associates, particularly those from the Bonanno orbit, disputed parts of his account, claiming he overstated how close he had been to being made or embellished certain relationships. Pistone countered that his story had already been tested in court under cross-examination, that tapes and corroborating witnesses backed key elements of what he described. Outside observers noted that, as with any memoir built around intensely personal and dangerous experiences, there would always be differences of perspective. Yet the core facts that he had spent years as an accepted associate, that his work had contributed to major convictions, that the Bonanno family's leadership had been shaken and reshaped in the wake of his exposure, were beyond serious dispute. Within law enforcement, the Brasco experience became a touchstone in debates over the proper scope and limits of undercover work. Even as he was still in the field, the Department of Justice had begun formalizing guidelines for such operations. Influenced by several high-profile cases, including the Abscam political corruption investigation and various organized crime probes. Those Attorney General's guidelines, refined over the years, sought to establish clearer standards for authorizing deep cover assignments, supervising agents, documenting authorized criminal activity, and providing psychological support to operatives who might be living for months or years under invented identities. Pistone's case was often cited in internal training and policy discussions, not only as a success, but as a cautionary example of how demanding such work could be. Commanders and legal advisors pointed to the strain on his family, the moral dilemmas inherent in befriending people you intended to help send to prison, and the difficulty of knowing when to end a productive operation before it pushed an agent past a safe threshold. In that sense, his legacy inside the FBI was double-edged. He had shown what could be achieved. He had also demonstrated why such achievements should be rare, carefully considered, and tightly managed. The broader culture, meanwhile, absorbed the story in its own way. After the film adaptation, the name Donnie Brasco entered the shorthand of popular speech in some circles, used as an easy reference for any deep-cover infiltration. Documentaries and television series on organized crime often featured him, whether in new interviews or archival footage. His voice, calm and matter-of-fact, became familiar to viewers of programs that dissected the rise and fall of the American Mafia or that explored the inner workings of the FBI. In these settings, he returned again and again to a few core points. That La Cosa Nostra, though weakened, was not entirely gone. That romanticizing the mob did a disservice to the victims of its schemes, and that undercover work, properly supervised, remained a crucial but dangerous tool in confronting adaptable criminal networks. Even as he stepped into these public roles, he maintained, as best he could, the habits of caution honed during the undercover years. Security experts have noted that contracts placed by mafia organizations rarely expire in any formal way. They may become less likely to be acted on as time passes and key figures die or go to prison, but they are not ceremoniously lifted. Pistone himself has stated in interviews that, as far as he knows, the price on his head was never officially withdrawn. He adjusted to that reality by keeping his residence and daily routines private, by using protective measures during public appearances, and by setting boundaries around how much of his domestic life he was willing to share with the media. Age brought a natural slowing to his pace, but not a retreat from engagement. Into his 70s and beyond, he continued to advise law enforcement agencies and appear in educational forums, sometimes in person, sometimes via recorded talks. He spoke to younger officers about the importance of understanding the communities in which they worked, not just as collections of potential suspects, but as complex networks of families, businesses, and informal hierarchies. He warned aspiring undercover agents that the bravado sometimes associated with going deep was misplaced. The real work, he emphasized, was quiet, repetitive, and psychologically taxing, requiring strong support structures and the humility to ask for help when the strain became too great. In quieter moments, when reflecting on his career, he has been clear about both his convictions and his regrets. He has said that if faced again with the choice of whether to undertake the operation, knowing what he now knows, he would still agree to do it. He believes that the damage done by entrenched organized crime to small business owners, to workers squeezed by corrupt unions, to communities intimidated into silence was serious enough to justify extraordinary efforts. At the same time, he has acknowledged that the cost to his family was higher than he could fully appreciate in 1976, when he first walked into New York bars as Donnie Brasco. The years of secrecy, the sudden relocations, the sense of living under a shadow they had not chosen, left marks that could not be erased simply by pointing to successful prosecutions. That duality, pride in the public value of his work, sorrow over its private consequences, runs through his later comments. He speaks with a measure of empathy even for some of the men he helped convict, noting that many of them were products of specific social and economic environments, drawn into crime by a combination of ambition, limited legitimate options, and the powerful pull of neighborhood culture. He does not excuse their choices. He does not question that society had to respond forcefully to their activities, but he refuses to portray them as one-dimensional villains, perhaps because he had seen too much of their ordinary, vulnerable sides during long nights in the back rooms of clubs and cafes. In histories of the American Mafia and of federal law enforcement, the Brasco operation occupies a distinctive place. Other undercover agents have spent months infiltrating drug cartels, extremist groups, or corrupt police units, and some have done so with equal courage and effectiveness. Yet the combination of length, depth, and cultural resonance in Pistone's assignment is unusual. It arrived at a particular moment, after decades of mafia dominance in certain sectors, but before technological advances, like widespread digital surveillance, reshaped investigative options when embedding a human being in the inner workings of a crime family could yield insights that wiretaps and informants alone could not. For scholars and practitioners trying to understand organized crime as a social phenomenon, his detailed accounts offer something rare: a sustained, ground-level view of how loyalty, fear, and profit interweave in the daily lives of those who join such organizations. For ethicists and legal theorists, his story raises enduring questions about the extent to which democratic societies should allow their agents to assume false identities, engage in limited criminal acts, and form personal bonds with targets in pursuit of larger justice. Those questions do not have simple answers, but any serious discussion of them in the American context now has to grapple with the example of Donnie Brasco. In the end, Joseph Dominic Pistone's life cannot be reduced solely to the 6 years he spent undercover. Yet those years cast a long shadow over everything that came before and after. The boy from Patterson, who learned to read people in crowded streets and tight-knit ethnic neighborhoods. The young man who served in naval intelligence. The investigator who cut his teeth on hijackings and smuggling cases. All those earlier experiences converged in the decision to become Donnie Brasco. Later, the retiree who wrote books, advised police departments, and watched actors recreate fragments of his past on screen, was still, in many ways, living in the aftermath of that decision. His story illustrates, with unusual clarity, the complex interplay between individual choice and institutional strategy, between personal courage and systemic change. It shows how one agent, operating within a much larger apparatus of laws, policies, and colleagues, can nonetheless make a decisive difference in weakening a powerful criminal organization. It also serves as a reminder that such victories are never cost-free, not for the communities that must endure years of investigation before relief comes, not for the families of those sent to prison, and not for the officers and agents who put their own safety and sanity on the line. Decades after he first walked into a New York bar and ordered a drink as Donnie Brasco, the echoes of that moment can still be felt in the way law enforcement approaches organized crime, in the stories filmmakers tell about the mafia, and in the training rooms where new agents learn what it might mean, someday, to live a lie for the sake of the law. For Joseph Pistone himself, the operation is no longer a daily reality but an indelible part of his identity, a chapter written in the compressed language of surveillance reports and court transcripts, and in the quieter, more complicated language of memory.